When she smiled at me that night, it wasn't the kind of smile you give someone you love. It was the kind you give someone you're sure you've already beaten. And when she said, almost lazily, that I should go ahead and walk out and see how long I lasted without her family's shadow covering me, I realized she had never once been curious about who I really was, only about how useful I could be to the life she wanted to keep living. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't try to remind her of the years I'd spent turning chaos into order behind closed doors. I just placed my keys on the stone counter, one by one, the way you might lay down pieces in a game you're finally done playing, and I walked out into the night without looking back. My name is Victor Hale. I'm in my mid-40s now, and for a long time I let people assume I was exactly what they needed me to be. A quiet presence, a convenient brain, a man who made numbers behave while others took credit for the results. By morning, her father was already shouting into a phone, though I wasn't there to hear it, and the first cracks were beginning to run through a structure I had built so carefully that everyone forgot it could only stand because I was still holding certain beams in place. Years earlier, I'd met Alara Watma at a fundraiser held in a converted theater, where donors drank overpriced wine beneath a ceiling no one had bothered to restore properly, and she had been standing beside a sculpture, pretending to understand it while actually watching the room to see who was watching her. I was younger then, still convinced that competence could hide in the shadow of confidence and be appreciated for what it was, and she was radiant in the way people are when they've never had to doubt their own importance. Her father, Grant Watma, ran a financial group that had started as a respectable regional operation and wanted very badly to be seen as something larger. And when we became engaged, he took me aside and told me, without cruelty but without warmth either, that his daughter had taste and connections but not patience for structure, and that if I wanted a place in their world, I'd need to prove I could build something that lasted. I did more than that, and I did it quietly, because that's what you do when you marry into a family that believes its name is a substitute for understanding how things actually work. Over the next decade and more, I rewrote their systems from the inside out, not with dramatic announcements or visible takeovers, but with careful frameworks, layered permissions, redundancies that looked boring until the day they were needed, and legal architectures designed to protect the firm from the kinds of impulsive decisions people make when they assume someone else will always clean up the consequences. I created trusts that talked to each other, oversight structures that required specific keys, and financial channels that could survive market panic because they were designed by someone who expected panic to happen eventually. Alara spent those years cultivating an image, joining boards, hosting events, and letting people assume her influence was the reason checks cleared and projects survived. And I told myself that applause wasn't the point, that stability was its own reward, even as I watched her introduce me at dinners as the numbers guy like I was a helpful accessory instead of the person who'd made her father's ambitions possible. The night everything finally broke, we were in the apartment overlooking the river, the one paid for by structures no one ever bothered to ask about, and she came in from another gala with her shoes in her hand and a glass already half empty, while I was reviewing documents that existed solely to keep her lifestyle from collapsing under its own weight. She asked with a bored laugh whether I was still playing with my little tables and charts, and when I told her those tables were the reason the lights were on and the staff was paid, she laughed again, not kindly, and said that everything in that room belonged to her family and always would. I felt something go very still inside my chest, the way it does when you finally understand a truth you've been avoiding, and when she dared me to leave and see how long I could survive without her name, I realized she truly believed I was a decoration, not a foundation. I didn't announce what I was doing, because I didn't need to, and because explanations are a kind of plea when you offer them to someone who's already decided what you are worth. I left, walked down more flights of stairs than I cared to count because I needed the time to think, and sent 3 short messages to 3 professionals who had been waiting for a single word from me for a long time. I didn't go to a hotel or a friend's couch. I went to a small office I'd kept separate for reasons even Alara never questioned, and I watched systems I had designed begin to do exactly what they were built to do when a specific authority was removed. Nothing illegal happened, nothing dramatic or cinematic, just the quiet rerouting of permissions, the freezing of optional channels, and the return of control to the points I had always reserved for myself in case the people using my work forgot who had made it possible. By the time the city began to wake, backup credit lines were stalled, discretionary funds were flagged, and a trust that paid for more than anyone wanted to admit had shifted its center of gravity back to me. Somewhere across town, Alara was still asleep, confident in a victory she didn't understand, and I sat with a cup of bitter coffee watching the early light hit buildings that had no idea how much of their stability depended on people who never made headlines. The calls started exactly when I knew they would, because panic follows predictable routes when it's forced to move through bureaucracies designed to keep people calm, and I let the first few ring without answering, not out of cruelty, but because timing matters when you're trying to make someone actually listen. When Grant finally got through, his voice was tight with the kind of control that only shows up when someone is trying not to admit they're afraid, and he demanded to know why a major facility had suddenly become unavailable, and why departments were getting contradictory alerts about access and oversight. I told him, evenly, that I had withdrawn my authorizations from structures that existed under my name and my responsibility, and that operational accounts would continue to function, while anything discretionary would need to be restructured without me. He started to argue, then stopped, because he knew exactly what he had signed years ago when he decided it was easier to trust me with the keys than to learn how the locks actually worked. In the background, I could hear Alara's voice, sharp and confused, asking what was happening and why anyone was calling so early. And when she took the phone from him a few minutes later, she didn't bother with pleasantries. She just accused me of trying to scare her into apologizing. I told her I wasn't interested in apologies, only in correcting a misunderstanding she'd been living with for years, and that when you tell the person who built your house to leave, you shouldn't be surprised if the lights start flickering. She said I was being dramatic, then she said I was being cruel, and finally she said I was making a mistake, and I told her she was finally learning the difference between comfort and dependence. By midday, her world had shrunk to a series of error messages and unreturned calls, and the people who usually smoothed things over were suddenly very busy elsewhere. When her oldest friend, Mara, showed up without warning, Alara assumed she'd come to offer sympathy, but instead she sat down and told her she'd known this was coming because I'd asked her to pay attention months earlier, not because I was planning revenge, but because I was trying to understand whether the person I'd married still existed. Mara showed her messages, not romantic or secretive, just worried and tired, and told her she'd warned me about a legal team being assembled quietly and about plans that didn't include me having a fair place in my own life. Alara tried to deny it, then tried to justify it, and finally just sat there while someone who had loved her for years explained, without raising her voice, that watching her treat people like furniture had become unbearable. When Mara left, she said something that stuck, that many of the people Alara thought were loyal to her were actually loyal to the work I'd done, because it had kept their own lives stable, and that respect is harder to lose than affection but also harder to fake. That afternoon, Alara went to her father's office expecting a strategy session and walked into something closer to an audit, with unfamiliar faces and documents spread out in ways that suggested decisions had already been made. They showed her numbers she'd never really looked at, totals she'd assumed were abstractions, and explained that a lifestyle built on the assumption of endless backing eventually becomes a liability when the person providing the structure steps away. They told her about personal debts she'd let accumulate, about a cultural fund she'd been championing that had only survived because I'd been quietly filling gaps, and about boards that were already preparing statements that would not be kind. Grant didn't yell, which was worse, and when he finally spoke it was to say that reputation isn't damaged by one bad week. It's damaged by years of assuming someone else will absorb the consequences. They mentioned needing to find me to negotiate to see whether anything could be stabilized, and Alara said, with a hollow certainty, that once I decided something was finished, I didn't reverse myself. I didn't hear about any of that until later, because I was meeting my daughter in a small cafe we used to visit when she was younger, the kind of place that smells like paper and coffee and old wood, where she could read for hours while I worked and neither of us felt rushed. Her name is Layla, and she didn't waste time with careful phrasing. She just asked whether I was trying to destroy the family and whether everything she'd grown up with was about to disappear. I told her the truth, not all of it, but enough, and explained that nothing had been destroyed, only revealed, and that structures built on misunderstandings tend to look like someone else's fault when they finally shift. She asked about her half-brother, Jonah, the son I'd had before I ever met Alara and whose existence had always been treated like an inconvenience. And when I told her he wasn't a secret so much as a subject her mother refused to allow in our house, she cried in the quiet way teenagers do when something they thought was simple turns out to be complicated. She said she wanted to meet him, that if he was family then he should feel like it. And in that moment I felt something ease that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. While that was happening, a meeting was being scheduled without me, one I could still see on calendars I'd designed long before anyone imagined they might want me gone, and someone inside decided I should hear it. Voices I recognized argued about leverage and collapse and the cost of pretending competence can be inherited. And when one of them said out loud that the entire operational spine of the company existed because I'd built it and that there was no override for my role, the room went quiet in a way that told me they were finally understanding what they'd been standing on. They talked about removing Alara from any position that involved decisions, about offering me formal authority independent of the marriage, and about how survival sometimes requires admitting you chose loyalty to the wrong thing. I didn't feel triumphant listening to it, just tired, because none of this needed to be a battle if someone had been willing to see me as a partner years earlier. A few days later, a plain envelope arrived with no return address and a note that said I deserved to know what I'd been building my life around, and inside was a report that was clinical in tone and devastating in detail. It documented a relationship Alara had been maintaining in parallel with our marriage, trips she'd said were work, expenses she'd said were necessary, and conversations that made it clear she'd been planning an exit that left me with nothing but the bill for her decisions. I didn't feel shocked so much as confirmed, and when a board member called to admit he'd commissioned the investigation because he couldn't stand watching talent be treated like a convenience, I thanked him and told him I wasn't sure I'd ever need to use it. Leverage is a strange thing, useful not because you want to apply it, but because it changes the way other people behave when they know you could. When Alara finally came to my office, she looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way people do when certainty has been taken away from them. She asked for 5 minutes like it was a favor, talked about counseling and mistakes, and how this had all gone too far, and I told her about the report, and about the other life she'd been funding with assumptions and borrowed patience. She cried, denied, then admitted just enough to hope I'd stop, and I told her I wasn't interested in humiliating her, only in leaving with what was fair and protecting the children who had nothing to do with our failures. I offered her a choice between a quiet settlement and a public fight, and for the first time in a long while she listened instead of assuming. The mediation that followed was efficient in the way only exhausted people can manage, with lawyers doing the talking and a neutral voice keeping score. And when it was over, signatures had replaced arguments and the future looked smaller but clearer. Leela chose to stay with me for a while. Jonah came to dinner and played guitar badly on purpose to make her laugh. And for the first time, our family felt like something that belonged to us instead of a performance for other people's expectations. Months later, when I walked into a boardroom as someone whose title matched his responsibility, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like alignment. And when a woman named Serena came to talk about expanding a fund I'd started quietly for reasons no one ever asked about, I realized that building something real is a habit, not a phase, and that the only permanence worth trusting is the kind you design yourself. The weeks that followed had a strange, weightless quality to them, as if time itself had decided to move more carefully now, that it no longer needed to keep up with a life built on performance. I spent mornings rebuilding routines that didn't revolve around anyone else's expectations, walking Leela to school when she let me, answering Jonah's late-night messages about design ideas and half-finished songs, and sitting in an office that finally felt like it belonged to the work instead of the politics around it. The company stabilized in the quiet way healthy systems do, not with dramatic announcements but with steady numbers and fewer emergency meetings. And people who had once spoken around me began speaking to me, as if they'd only just realized I'd always been part of the conversation. I didn't take any pleasure in hearing how difficult things were for Alara in her new life, but I did notice how often her name came up followed by long, uncomfortable silences, the kind that suggest a story everyone knows but no one wants to repeat out loud. It wasn't revenge I felt, just a distant acknowledgement that actions have echoes, and that some rooms remember the sound of doors closing longer than others do. One afternoon, Grant asked to see me alone, not in his office but in a small conference room he used when he didn't want walls listening, and he looked older than I remembered, not in years but in posture, as if the weight of realizing how close he'd come to losing everything had settled somewhere between his shoulders and decided to stay. He didn't apologize directly, which I hadn't expected, but he did say that he'd confused loyalty with tradition for too long, and that tradition has a way of demanding payment when you stop questioning it. We talked about structures and safeguards, about how success attracts people who assume it's indestructible, and about how easily families mistake familiarity for trust. When he finally stood to leave, he said something that surprised me, that he should have taught his daughter how things worked instead of teaching her how to look like she didn't need to know. And for a moment, I saw not the executive or the father-in-law, but a man trying to rewrite a past that no longer belonged to him. Leela settled into a rhythm that made me quietly proud, splitting her time between studying and discovering just how many opinions she had about everything. And Jonah began dropping by more often, sometimes with sketches, sometimes with nothing but stories about professors who mistook volume for authority. Watching them talk to each other, argue about music, trade jokes that didn't need me to translate, I realized how much of my life I'd spent compartmentalizing love, not because I wanted to, but because someone else had insisted there was only room for one version of family at a time. It turned out there was room for more, and the space felt lighter for it, like a house that finally had its windows opened after years of carefully managed air. Serena and I started meeting for coffee under the pretense of discussing funding structures, and somehow always ended up talking about everything except money by the time the cups were empty. She had a way of listening that made silence feel useful instead of awkward, and she asked questions that weren't traps, just invitations, which I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When she told me about moving cities to escape a life that had become too predictable, I didn't tell her I understood, but I think she saw it anyway in the way I didn't rush to fill the space between her words. We didn't label anything, didn't rush, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't measuring my future in terms of what it needed to protect, only in terms of what it might allow. The company's annual report came out without fanfare, which in that world is the closest thing to praise, and I read it in my office late one evening, noticing how often the word stability appeared where growth used to be the star. It felt like a compliment, even if no one had intended it that way, because stability is what lets people sleep, and I'd spent too many years watching people chase expansion like it was proof of worth. When a junior analyst stopped by to thank me for rewriting a process that had been quietly burning everyone out, I realized that influence doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like fewer emergencies and more weekends. I heard, eventually, that Alara had tried to restart her career somewhere that didn't know her history, and I hoped, honestly, that it worked, not because I wanted her to be rewarded, but because I didn't want bitterness to be the last thing we ever shared. People grow at different speeds, and sometimes they only notice the distance when it's too wide to cross without rebuilding the bridge from both sides. I didn't follow her life, didn't ask about it, but when I thought of her, it was with a kind of neutral distance, the way you think of a city you once lived in and don't plan to return to, not because it was all bad, but because you've already learned what you needed there. There was a night when the power went out in half the neighborhood, and we ended up eating dinner by candlelight, laughing at how dramatic everything looks when it's dimmed. And Jonah played guitar while Leela tried to sing and failed spectacularly on purpose. I watched them and felt something settle into place, not triumph, not relief, but a steady sense of having arrived somewhere that didn't need to be defended. Later, when the lights came back on, no one rushed to change the mood, and I realized that the best systems, whether they're families or companies, aren't the ones that never fail, but the ones that don't fall apart when they do. Serena and I took a walk along the river one weekend, not talking about work, not talking about the past, just letting the city move around us. And at some point she said that she liked the way I paid attention, not in the intense way that feels like pressure, but in the quiet way that makes room for other people to exist. I didn't have a clever answer, so I just said that I'd spent a long time building things for people who never noticed the effort, and that it was nice to finally build something that noticed me back. She smiled at that, and for once I didn't wonder what the smile meant or what it would cost. On the anniversary of the day I'd left, I didn't mark it with anything dramatic, just took the afternoon off and walked through parts of the city I'd only ever seen through car windows. I sat in a small park, watched strangers argue and reconcile over nothing, and thought about how many versions of myself I'd been in the same place without realizing it. It wasn't nostalgia I felt, and it wasn't regret either, just an understanding that endings are often quieter than beginnings and far more honest. That night, back on my balcony, I looked out at the water and thought about how easily people confuse possession with permanence, and how strange it is that we build our lives around things we don't always bother to understand. I hadn't lost everything the way I'd been told I would, and I hadn't won in any way that would make a good story at a party, but I had something better than either: a life that fit, relationships that didn't require translation, and work that didn't need to hide behind someone else's name. The foundation held because it had been built to, and on it I wasn't proving anything anymore, I was simply living, which turned out to be the most radical change of all.